Welcome to Epic Begins with One Step Forward, the podcast that reveals how to plan, achieve, and enjoy the journey of creating epic results in your life, business, health, and relationships. Here's your host, best-selling author and motivational speaker, Xander Sprague.
Hello, epic people, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Epic Begins with One Step Forward. I'm your host, Xander Sprague, and today I am so honored to be joined by Otjen. AJ, tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a professor at Montana State University. I grew up in Oklahoma. I moved to Montana after my career in the corporate world, about 25 years, to become a professor. And I started writing academically when I became a professor, and about 10 years ago, creatively. And then I met Dan Steffensen, and he asked me to write his story about being burned over as a firefighter. And so it was a difficult experience because it was a difficult subject matter. And it took about 2.5 years to capture the story of Dan being burned as a firefighter and surviving, which he should not have done. And everybody prayed, his community, his family came together to bring him home. It's very important for him to come back home to his community.
Definitely. And truly an epic story. So can you share just a little, we'll get into it, but just sort of, you gave us a brief overview, but burnover is actually a term that forest fighters use. And go ahead and tell the audience what that means.
It's the two most terrifying words that come over the radio. And he said it as the fire had hit him, and he didn't realize he was hurt. But everybody listening to the radio frequency that day heard him say, "We're burned over. We're out of the fight. We need help." It basically means the fire has come right on top of you and burned you over. And it's, and he, in his case, he and his partner who was in the engine, they were fighting a little fire, a little 2-foot fire, grass fire, and didn't realize, because the National Weather Service has a delay in getting information out to the firefighters, that there was a storm about 60 miles away, a thunderstorm, but in front of that thunderstorm is a downdraft of wind, about 70 miles an hour. And with that wind came a wall of fire, at least 60 feet high, that nobody saw coming until he just heard a train coming right at him. He turned around and this wall of fire just burned right over him. And that's what a burnover is. So they happen in wildfires.
They
burnovers.
They do.
And when you say I've been burned over, that's terrifying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so obviously he was injured incredibly.
60% of his body had third-degree burns. He didn't realize it. He thought, he screamed, "Go to the black." That's the safety zone. That means that's the area that's already been burned. It's called the black. And that's their safety escape route. And so he looked at Scott and said, "Go to the black." And so Scott started driving the truck towards the black, and Dan was right behind him, and he was the engine was on fire, and he was putting the engine out, so it would, putting all the flames out. Scott was inside, felt like an oven. He ended up not being hurt. He just got really hot. And they got to the black, and Scott jumped out of the engine looking for Dan, and Dan was just taking everything off because it was so hot. his hat, his radio harness, his belt, everything was so hot. He just it was like touching an oven.
Sure.
And he didn't, and then his clothes started falling off because they were so burnt, and he didn't realize he was burned, because once you're the nerves are burned away. So there's no pain.
Absolutely.
And he's like, and the chief came over. He got on the radio and said, "Well, we're burned over. We're out of the fight," reluctantly, because he didn't want to stop fighting the fire. And so the chief shows up, and he takes one look at him and gets on the radio and says, "Get that ambulance here now." And Dan's like, "I'm okay. I don't need to go anywhere. I'm fine." And his face is turning yellow, and his ears are starting to flake off.
Yeah.
He has no mustache. His hair is gone. And then the chief is getting more and more frantic on the radio, going, "Get that ambulance here now!" Because they had tried for air support, but the same storm that had blown, the helicopter off the bluff that had hit Dan, there is no way they're going to get air support to Dan to get into the hospital.
Definitely.
And they all know each other. It's a small little county. And the EMT showed up and just said, "Load and go."
Yeah.
She said she thought he was going to die on the way to the hospital. It was so bad.
And having talked to you before this interview, I'm aware that Dan is, I would say he's a true Montana man. He's a tough, he's a tough cookie.
Yeah, he's a tough son of a gun. I think I described him in the book going through three syndromes in this book. In the beginning, he was a grumpy old man. That's a syndrome that the firefighters have when they're not fighting fires and they're sitting around in the firehouse. It's the grumpy old man syndrome is what they call it. And he was even more so because the woman in his life, Marnie, had passed away a year before this incident. So he was definitely a grumpy old man beforehand. And then when he was going through the recovery of the burn, he was considered a tough old bastard because the workman's comp guy who paid all the bills from Montana, he was looking at all these surgeries, all this wound care, and he just said, "My God, this man must be a tough old bastard." So that was the tough old bastard syndrome. And then later, as he was going through PT and wound care with the nurses, he hated every minute of it, wouldn't do what they said, "I'm not hurt," grumpy. So they said that he was a stubborn old fool. So I called that the stubborn old fool syndrome period. But, he needed all three of those things, grumpy old man, tough old bastard, stubborn old fool to get through this and survive. And he's the first one to say, "I am who I am, and I'm not, take me or leave me." And he didn't use this word, but he admitted that he was a jerk.
Yeah.
And that, that's who I am, that's just who I am.
Well, it would seem to me that with that amount of injury that you would have to be tough, stubborn bastard to be like, no, I'm not going anywhere. And I'm going to guess that perhaps he was also a little grumpy that he couldn't be out fighting fires.
Horribly grumpy because he had worked forever. He had trained so hard. He became a firefighter late in life, and he had trained so hard. He was now a senior firefighter. He was nationally qualified. He was a trainer, a mentor to so many of the people in the firehouse. And Red Lodge, the town, is such a small town, such a tight community, that he was basically beloved by everybody in town. Mm-hmm. And the Red Lodge had had such a bad summer. It was called the Summer of Hell, still remembered that way, because it started with a very bad fire that had come over the mountains and come right to the edge of town where they were about to evacuate the town. And then a hiker, a graduate of Montana State University, she had gone up hiking and then didn't come back down. So they had search and rescue out looking for her all summer long. And then Dan got burned. And then another firefighter, a very talented snowboarder, he had fallen off of a skateboarder and hit his head. And then he ended up on life support. And then he eventually died. So they were all saying, "Dan, you've got to live. You've got to come home to us. You've got to, heal from these burns." He had been flown to Utah, Salt Lake City, and was in a coma for 24 days. And now the town was saying, "Dan, you've got to come home to us. You've got to live. We cannot take any more tragedy.
Right.
You've got to come home." And when I realized, that he was so important to the town, and him living and getting through this ordeal of all the burn recovery, they prayed for him every day. They needed him to come home. And when I realized how important that was, that's when I realized that, this book had to be good. This story had to be told.
Absolutely.
And he was just he was as tough as they needed to be. And they all said, "We're fortunate that he's so tough, that he was the one that went through this, or we would have lost him too."
Definitely. Definitely. Now, that decision to write a book, I mean, I certainly know deciding to write a book seems easy enough. Oh, I should write a book.
Right.
But then the reality quickly sets in that writing a book is easy. And it would seem to me that trying to get Dan's story might have been challenging for you.
Hard as hell, I would say. Well, it was Dan's idea. Dan wanted to, people kept saying, you ought to write a book, Dan, you ought to write a book. And he agreed, but he didn't think he knew how. And I met him when my students were doing a marketing campaign for the personal protective equipment that he was wearing that saved his life, basically, the Nomex material.
Right.
And so he ended up being the star of our ad campaign, saying, please help raise money so that all firefighters can survive like I did.
Right.
And so I met him on that shoot. And he had read a couple of other books I'd written. And he said, would you write my book? And I went, I've never written a nonfiction novel before. But how do you say no, to a burned over firefighter who wants to tell a story?
Definitely.
And everybody volunteers for the fire department. So I thought, oh, well, I guess I have no choice. So it took us 2.5 years, and it was incredibly difficult because, he's difficult and he doesn't share his feelings, and he wanted it to be a fire book. And as I got more and more into it, I said, this isn't a fire book, Dan, this is a very human story. And that meant he had to open up a lot, which he did not want to do, and he cried a lot telling the story, and I cried a lot, and I interviewed 50 people and they all cried a lot. And then I had to do a lot of research to learn about firefighting and training and weather and radio frequencies and burn healing and medicine and hospitals. And
definitely.
And then I probably rewrote it 20 times to try to get it right. It was really difficult, and I knew I had to finish it though, because he kept telling everybody his book was coming out, and I was like, oh gosh, okay, well, we're going to get it done.
Absolutely.
So, yes. So it was his decision, and I said yes. And so, but we stuck it out and got it done.
Were there days, AJ, where you thought, why did I say yes?
Oh, so many. And there were times and he says we butted heads. I would say we fought. We fought really hard. Oh gosh, sometimes I remember there were 2 weeks when we didn't speak to each other, and I thought, how are we ever going to finish this book? We would get so mad at each other, and then we would hug it out and cry and say, okay, we can keep going.
Definitely.
It was. And after it was finished and we were kind of doing the tour of promoting it, somebody said, well, was it a lot of fun writing this book? And we both went, no, it was not fun writing this book.
Fun would not be the adjective I would use.
No. But we became incredibly close. Even though there were times when we just hated each other, we were still very close. And I think we always, to this day, trusted each other. There's a lot of trust. He told everybody, no one knows me as well as AJ knows me. And that's true to this day. Because he told me things that he hasn't told anybody.
Sure.
And not all of it's in the book, thank God. It's just, we had to be that close for me to understand who he is, how he got into this position, why he was estranged from his family, and how that was so important that they all came running as soon as they got the call that he had been burned. Because firefighter families go through a lot. They take in a lot. And his family had never experienced being a firefighter family until this happened.
Definitely.
Because they had been, and so all of a sudden, the very worst thing that can happen is what happened to them. And now they're all in Utah going, okay, well, I guess we better, let bygones be bygones and all come together to save this man.
Definitely.
And that's what happened. They did. A lot of this book is about family. It's about community. It's about love. There is so much, and I wanted to capture the love on the page, and that was, how to do that. I had to really try to become a narrative writer, which I wasn't, and that took me a lot of learning. I had to learn how to become a narrative writer.
That is certainly that's an epic journey for you.
It is. Yes, it is.
And like any epic journey, there are the roadblocks. We won't name any particularly large ones, Dan.
Yes, I can look back and laugh at it now, right?
Exactly. Or detours, right? I mean, you think you're going down one way, and all of a sudden you you're like, oh, what? Hold on. Here's this detour that we have to go down. Perhaps it's the family relationship. Maybe it's, a story that he chooses to share with you that all of a sudden you're like, all right, well, now this gives us a new color to put into the book. And how do I get this in? I mean, I know in
Right.
writing my books that it's like what to include, what not to include. Did I,
Uh-huh.
it's clear in my mind, but is it clear on the page? You know what I mean? And
Right. And I would have so many parts of it written, and then I wouldn't know how to start. The first chapter was one of the hardest things to write because it's like, how do I start this thing and give it a foundation so that the readers kind of get an idea of where this is, who everybody is, who Dan is, just to get it started. Because I
absolutely.
had to let everybody know, I had to let everybody know how close everybody was, how grumpy he was, and how beautiful Red Lodge was, all in the first chapter.
Absolutely. And it's
So I had
often
to
the
set
case.
I had to set that much of the stage, in the first chapter. Yeah.
And obviously, because you teach marketing, you're fully aware, more so of, like, I got to grab them at the beginning so they're interested and will listen and or read on. And oftentimes,
Well, yeah, but to get the backstory in and make it interesting in the first chapter, I found so daunting. Like, okay, the backstory is so boring, but how do I make it so that but something good's coming,
definitely, definitely,
make the backstory. I tried to make Red Lodge beautiful in the first few paragraphs, and let them know something really scary is coming about this beautiful place,
definitely.
and then it took me a while to figure out how to make the first page and the first paragraph interesting enough to keep going. Yeah.
Yes,
So
absolutely. And one thing that if the listeners, you've thought of writing a book, oftentimes what happens is, especially in a narrative story like you're talking about, AJ, the first chapter is actually the last thing written because now you have the whole story. So you're like, okay, here's what I need to put in. You don't sit down and go, right, here's my first chapter, because you don't have the whole story. So you
right.
don't know what do I want to tease? How do I put it together? And you're right. You probably you're like, oh my
Right.
God, this is a fascinating story, but how do I begin this? So
Yes, I thought I had a couple of times, but when I went back and looked, I went, no, I had a terrible beginning or a terrible opening. I rewrote that thing probably 20 times, and I really didn't have it until I understood how important the Red Lodge community was and how important it was for him to come home. Once I grasped that and interviewed so many people from Red Lodge, then I felt like I had it, and I went back and I rewrote the entire book, pretty much making the hook be Red Lodge was hurting and he had to come home to Red Lodge. And
definitely.
that became the story for me is, okay, here's Red Lodge fire. Here's this one guy within all of this. And oh my God, kaboom. It was chapter 6 when I finally said, okay, one of them's on fire.
Yeah,
And then it was all about getting him back home.
definitely.
Yeah. And that was sort of the structure of the whole story. Was, poor Red Lodge, poor this guy, beautiful Red Lodge, family of Red Lodge. Oh my God, somebody got burned, and how does he come home? That's kind of
Right,
that's sort of that became the structure of the story,
right,
because the firefighter community is so close, and Red Lodge is made up of firefighters or the family of firefighters,
right.
because they sit right on the edge of Yellowstone Park, surrounded by forest and fuel,
Yeah,
and so they all stay on alert during fire season. That's what they're trained to do. And
definitely.
they had never had anybody get burned over before.
Oh,
This was huge for them. It was huge. Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, it was just so emotional for all of them.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now, have you found that the fire season seems to have grown longer?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It used to be like July, August, and September, and now it's May to October
Wow.
easily. Yeah.
So basically, if it's not
Yeah.
snowing, it could be fiery.
It's yeah, if it's not snowing, it's burning. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
That's Montana. Yeah.
So for you, AJ, what have been one or two of the areas that you found that you grew or you discovered about yourself in doing this project?
Oh, goodness. Well, I found that I opened up more to people and to having emotion myself and making and having relationships as well. I made a lot of friends through this book, burn survivors, the people, people in Red Lodge is about an hour from where I live. And so now I have a lot more friends in Red Lodge and firefighters, the firefighter community. I feel like I'm sort of a part of it now, and it's a fantastic community. So that just because I felt like I was opening up to the emotions, their emotions, and making friends with them and trusting to have good connections, I probably was much more closed off, kind of like Dan, not as bad as Dan, but
Right.
that direction. And I learned that that's not the way to be, that you really need to open yourself up to love more. And I think that that's one of the things that I learned through this process. I also learned that that it's important that somebody asked me, what's the key to writing a good book? And I say, I think it's important to fall in love with your subject matter, fall in love with the town, fall in love with the subject, fall in love with everything about it so that you can feel the pain, feel the emotions, because you're never going to get any of that right on the book if you're just not in there, if you're not involved with everything
Absolutely.
about the story.
Yeah, I mean, your authentic voice can't come through if you're not writing from a place of authenticity, I mean, good writing is good writing.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I tried. I tried.
Well, I
felt like
I get you. My books, I sort of took the attitude when I got done writing. I'm like, all right, well, there it is. Because
yes,
I've said what I want to say, how I want to say it. And any author will tell you that perhaps the hardest part is not the actual writing, but it's the editing of the book, because you start to second guess. Oh, have I said that right?
And I read it now. And I think, I think I'll. If on the second printing, I'm going to change this and change that and change that. I see lots of things I want to change on the second printing.
Yeah.
And it's not typos. It's like, I think I could have written that line better. I could have written that line better.
Right.
But I have to admit, the ending is. I really like the ending only because I was inspired by it when Dan, when he was fighting fires in 2023. He did make it back on the fire line. 2 years after he was burned, he fought so hard.
Wow.
And he sent me a picture. Yeah, that's how tough he is. In 2023, he was fighting fires in the western part of the state, and he sent me a picture of his new engine. They have a fondness for engines, and he always thought engine 78 or E78 was his engine, which he burned over,
right.
in the fire. But they got a new E78. And so he sent me a picture of the new E78 that he had in western Montana. And I said, is that the new E78? And he said, yeah. And that inspired me for the ending, which I won't tell everybody. But I wrote it, and I said it to him, and he said, I'm crying. I said, yeah, me too. I made him cry for the end of the book. And so I every once in a while there's a page where I imagined a scene to sort of sum it all up. And that always made me feel like I came up with something that, one scene here or two that was creative license to kind of fill in the gaps to have the story unfold.
Definitely.
But,
No, definitely. And it's the editing of the book, there comes a point where you've read your book through, you're doing the proofreading and stuff. And I don't know about you, AJ, but I certainly got to a point where I was like, I really don't want to read my book again for just a little bit, because I've just read my book like 6 times.
Yeah. Oh,
and
20. At least 20.
Yeah, like you're just going through. Maybe you want to you decide to change this sentence or whatever. You're trying to make sure that you and the other eyes looking are trying to find if there are any punctuation problems. Did you forget a comma, a semicolon, whatever?
Well,
but
and
there
when
has
it's
to be good
nonfiction,
enough. Like there comes a point where you're like, okay, it's fine. It's good enough. We want perfection, but you're just it's a
well, and mine has a bibliography in it because I quoted Hemingway or Jimmy Buffett in places, or other. I have a bibliography which had to be exactly right, and the publisher made me go over that bibliography 10 times to make sure it was right. So that was one thing, and so the footnotes, the bibliography, that took another month to make sure it was right. And so the publisher did provide a really good editor and a really good proofreader.
Right. Yeah.
And that helped. Yeah. The proofreader, that proofreader found so many things that were off, and like you said, quotation marks, periods. I'm like, boy, you're good. And the bibliography is always difficult because it's colons and page numbers, and
absolutely.
That helped a lot.
Absolutely. And there comes a point where you've read your book so much that what you want to say, and there are times where afterwards it comes out, and then you realize that you missed something. You and the proofreader, and you all missed something. And in part, that's a psychological thing of you've read it so often, what you're saying, how it goes, and your eye skips over the fact that you forgot a colon or a quotation mark or whatever, because there's a quote, and it's an open-ended quotation. You're like, oh man, how did we miss that? Well, it happens because you spent so much time with it that you sort of become blind to it, because you know what it is, So,
right. Yeah. You can see it too many times. That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So AJ, remind people what the name of the book is, where they can get it.
Okay. It's called Burned Over: The Survival of Montana Firefighter Dan Steffensen. And it's available on Amazon in Kindle and Audible and in print. And you can find out more about it on my website, which is ajotjen.com. And then you just go to books/burned over. Cool. It's all there with all sorts of links to Audible and everything. So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, AJ, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Such an epic conversation. And thank you for
thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
I want to remind everyone that if you're ready to begin your epic journey, go to epicbegins.com. And as always, remember, epic choices lead to the epic life that you want.
Get your gift copy of the award-winning book, Epic Begins with One Step Forward, at epicbegins.com. That's a wrap on this episode of Epic Begins with One Step Forward with your host, Xander Sprague, best-selling author, internationally acclaimed public speaker, and licensed professional clinical counselor. To make your next conference or event epic, send an email to Xander at zander@epicbegins.com. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Remember, epic choices, epic life.